SnowTrax is brought to you by Polaris, think outside. Ski-Doo, winter lovers, get out there and experience that Ski-Doo feeling. And by Hercules Tire, ride on our strength.
You might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed by how much coverage Ski-Doo's 2024 850 E-TEC Turbo trail sled is getting these days, but it's all for a very good reason. It only takes one ride on the turbocharged Competition Package 850 two-stroke trail sled to get even the most repressed snowmobiler excited. While there's already a lot of info about this power package out there, the responses we got on our virtual hangout on this sled on YouTube proved viewers were looking for a bit more in-depth information. So I called in a few favors at BRP and got on the phone with the guys who actually designed this motor to get as much info as they were allowed to give me. And what I found out actually kind of surprised me. First, it would be understandable if you believed, as I did, that the turbocharged trail version of the 850 E-TEC was different from the naturally aspirated 850 E-TEC. It's a reasonable assumption. Two-strokes aren't known to handle boost very well without making some important changes. So why then are the naturally aspirated and boosted versions of the 850 E-TEC identical inside and out? Like, how is that even possible? Even the compression ratios are identical. Literally, the parts inside out are exactly the same. The reason is that Ski-Doo knew the 850 E-TEC would eventually have a factory turbo from the first day they started designing the motor over 7 years ago, back when the idea of a factory turbocharged two-stroke trail sled was basically just a pipe dream for us. The BRP engine guys were already figuring out how to do it. So this is definitely interesting, but it's also extremely important, because the fact that the turbocharged version of the 850 has the exact same compression ratio as the naturally aspirated version is a fundamentally important part of why this engine works so well. Where most turbocharged engines compensate for the additional internal pressures by lowering the compression ratio and therefore losing power before the boost kicks in, the ETech Turbo maintains the exact same level of performance pre-boost as the NA version. So between the time of hitting the throttle and the boost kicking in, you still get all the impressive power of an 850 with no compromises. This was something that was immediately noticeable the first time I rode this sled, and something anybody who's upgrading to a Ski-Doo 850 Turbo is really going to appreciate. It also means that when you're simply trail riding the turbo but not pushing it hard enough to get into the boost, you'll still enjoy exactly the same fuel efficiency as the non-boost 850. The only time you actually use more fuel is when you get on the gas and really push it hard. So it's like a pay-to-play system. You only spend extra on fuel when you really want to. The second thing I learned about Ski-Doo's 850 E-TEC Turbo is that the story behind its methanol injection system is a lot more complex than simply not wanting to use an intercooler to lower intake temps. In fact, the reason behind this choice was the complete opposite of what I think most of us assumed it was, which is that the system created too much heat for an intercooler to manage, when in fact the truth is that the system doesn't create enough heat for an intercooler to do any good. And the reason behind this is pretty straightforward. Everyone knows that one of the most important aspects of turbocharged engine performance is intake air temperature. Compressing air generates heat. Every joint or fitting in the intake track of a turbocharged engine has the potential to leak boost pressure. When that compressed air pressure is lost, the turbo has to work harder to create more boost to compensate. This extra boost generates more heat. Typically, you'd add an intercooler to help reduce that heat. But the intercooler itself requires more joints and fittings with the potential to leak even more boost pressure. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. BRP engineers spent countless hours designing a turbo and an intake track that would have the least amount of pressure loss possible, which in turn would require the least amount of boost possible, which in turn would create the least amount of heat possible. The end result was intake air temps that were so low an intercooler was actually ineffective in cooling it any further. So the idea came up to design a methanol injection system to do the job the intercooler was too inefficient to do, and the result is definitely clear. The final thing I want to talk about is what is a methanol injection system and how does it work? But before I do that, I need to clear up a couple misconceptions. First, it's called a methanol injection system. However, that isn't entirely accurate. It's actually a water injection system. It's the water that actually does the work of cooling the intake track. And second, the methanol's only job is to keep the water from freezing. It serves no actual mechanical function. The injection happens between the throttle body and the reed pedals. This is to ensure that it gets evenly mixed with the air and the fuel, and that it gets evenly dispersed between both cylinders. The water itself actually does two different things. First, it cools the intake air temps, which is paramount to creating maximum horsepower. However, it also reduces the temperature of the actual cylinder itself when the water is vaporized during combustion. This helps prevent detonation. The system was designed to be seamless and invisible, which means you, the rider, can't tell when it's happening. And I can confirm after riding it that you can't, in fact, tell when it's happening at all. Another important clarification that needs to be made is that the methanol mixture BRP sells is not the same as other methanol mixtures you can find at the auto parts store. It includes anti-foaming agents and additional lubrication agents that are absolutely necessary for the system to function properly. So, don't cheap out. Just buy the XPS Go Fast juice. I hope this has given you, as it has me, more insight into how Skidoo's 850 Turbo Trail Sled was designed and why it was designed the way it was. It certainly has given me a better appreciation for what's actually happening under the hood.
So it's really no surprise when I say that GPS functionality and inclusion is becoming as important to snowmobile buyers as it is to car and truck buyers. Now, if your sled didn't come with a preferred GPS gauge already installed from the factory, there's a high likelihood that you can buy it and install it into your current ride without having to trade that sled back in. And to prove that it can be done, I've gone ahead and ordered all the necessary parts to make it work through my Polaris dealer. I've got the 7S display, a mounting kit, as well as some hardware to harness it up to my sled. Now, when it comes to changing a head unit on an automotive vehicle, there's wiring involved and it can get pretty interesting. But with this being a Polaris sled and a Polaris display system, we have everything we need to make it happen plug and play. If you're looking to do this upgrade, the display and harness needed runs around $1,850 Canadian and $1,450 US. So don't feel too worried about tackling this yourself at home should you be interested in doing an upgrade yourself. Now let's get into the nitty gritty on this brand new 2024 Polaris Indy SP 650. Taking off the side panel and hood gives us access to the hood removed from the sled. I pop out the headlight, take a few screws out that secure the top pod to the hood, and flip it over to reveal the top pod removal. At this point, I'm going to take out the storage door and stock display. There's a location already marked for the GPS antenna to stick onto, so I'll go ahead and secure that. Now on the one side of the top pod is another cool piece of tech that you probably didn't even know was there on a 7S equipped vehicle. It's this little spot we pop out a dust cover and drop in the V2V antenna so the 7S can talk to other sleds nearby. So from here it's pretty straightforward. We drop the 7S display into the front panel that already has the cutout for the display. It even has the pre-drilled holes for the fasteners to keep the display inside of the cover. I mean, it can't get simpler. I'm going to go ahead and attach all the necessary cables to the back of the screen as well as route the USB cable through the supplied fasteners. There's also a cool Easter egg on the back of this wire plate that's pretty neat with the stars and the Polaris logo. At this point, I drop the assembly door into the hood pod, connect a few wires, and then go ahead and put the hood pod back onto the hood assembly, and rebuild the hood and headlight and drop it back into the sled. The wire harness matches up perfectly to the stock connector under the hood, so you're ready to reassemble and plug and play this new hardware. I button back on the hood and side panels, and we are ready to rock. So why would you want to make this upgrade on a non-7S sled? Well, for those of you who've never used a 7S display, I'm going to explain this just a bit further. With built-in maps and dedicated GPS tracking with no cell device required, it's the only true GPS display in the industry. Polaris also has a relationship with almost all of the North American snowmobile federations, so you have up-to-date mapping. Having the GPS at the heads-up eye level gives you a smooth transition between your map and the trail, and the integrated options like waypoints, points of interest, restaurants, gas stations, and lodging are all invaluable. The group ride features are second to none, and thanks to the V2V antenna we installed, we can see our friends who also have the 7S display installed or the Ride Command app on their phones. We can label other riders and then touch on the screen to show us where that rider is in relation to us, how fast they're going, or if they're stopped, allowing us to keep track of our entire ride group right on screen. The 7S also allows us to send basic messages between sleds to let others know if we need assistance. On top of the obvious GPS features, the 7S also is home to multiple screen widgets that allow us to customize home screen displays, set up to our liking, access features like smart warmer settings, and even live vehicle diagnostics to show us if any error codes exist and the critical level of those codes. Because the 7S is Bluetooth ready, you can also link your phone to see live alerts when getting a text message or phone call. Now, there really is a lot to love about the 7S display out on the trail. And yes, I have had a lot of people tell me I don't want more technology when I'm out riding. But once you've had the chance to use a 7S display, you're going to understand why you never want a snowmobile without one. And don't forget, when it comes to resale and therefore demand of a 7S equipped snowmobile, it is much greater than the non-equipped counterparts.
Trail Tech is sponsored by Princess Auto. Ideas, tools.
During last week's episode, I took the 2024 Ski-Doo Competition Package 850 Turbo 2-stroke and gave it the traction it was begging for both front and rear, so that we could get everything out of this sled that the ROTAX Turbo wants to give us. And we love the way this sled takes off, stops and delivers all that boosted 2-stroke goodness to forwards momentum. However, we did have a couple of things we wouldn't mind improving on now that we have some seat time on it. And number one is that we're experiencing lower snow conditions than usual across most of North America, but low snow or not, we're still gonna ride. Doesn't matter, nothing's holding us back, but that does come at a cost. When the trail conditions are skinny, your skis take the abuse, and new lightweight plastic skis aren't cheap. And when you put them up against bare parking lots and overridden trails or rapidly declining trails at the end of the season, you can find that your carbides and host bars aren't the only things starting to wear down. Yeah, your plastic skis will start to wear out too. And yes, you know that there's an answer to that I'm gonna show you today. Now, the Woodies Navigator is a pretty simple little piece of steel that's gonna do wonders for your skis in more ways than one. Let me show you exactly how they work. Installing at the front of your skis and working in harmony with any single runner in the industry, as well as the Woodies dually, the Navigator will be the first thing the ground contacts instead of your nice plastic ski. These steel protectors transfer the wear off of your ski onto the steel plate and stay locked in thanks to a front locating tang and the rear fork section that meshes with your carbide runner. And given the cost of new sleds in 2024, not to mention this 850 Turbo Competition Package, I know a small investment to keep even the skis from wearing out is well worth it in my books. Remember ski skins from the 90s? Well, this is a similar idea for plastic skis. It's also interesting to note that if you've already abused your current skis, installing the Navigators onto your moderately worn ones will stop the deterioration and keep them performing for years to come. So both preventative and repair in one step. Now, I did say that these help in more ways than one, and the second area is equally as important as the first, and that is that the Navigators are also designed to help reduce darting. Now, because of the large flat steel surface in front of your carbides that's taking the initial abuse of ground contact, when that flat section of the Navigator contacts the snow, it actually packs the surface before your carbide runner host bar has a chance to jump into a groove already in the snow from other sleds. Or to put it simply, the Navigator is a little groomer working 24/7 on the front of your skis, setting up the perfect conditions for your host bar to cut into the snow with a fresh-to-you path. It's like the first pass after the groomer's gone through for your runners, and it's the reason why they reduce darting so much. Fresh tracks don't dart. And with the number of studs we put in the rear of this sled, I'll be happy to have that fresh cutting path for my runners to give me the least amount of darting. Keeping your darting potential low while also increasing the lifespan of your plastic skis are two things that I think that just about every rider can benefit from. When you're talking about a company that's American-made with over 50 years of innovation experience like Woodies has, I know it's a product that I can trust.
SnowTrax has been brought to you by Arctic Cat, share our passion. Outaouais Tourism, snow-covered landscapes to explore. And by FXR, brings you more.
Anyone who's watched SnowTrax already knows that I have very strong feelings about what is a true crossover snowmobile. What are the things, what are the characteristics that it absolutely has to have? And for me, one of the hallmarks of a real crossover sled, or at least a class-leading crossover sled, is a trail width front end, 42 inches wide. The Riot is Arctic Cat's new crossover sled. It's a 146, it's based on the Catalyst platform, but it has a 38 to 40 inch wide adjustable front end. So let's just talk about it right away. What is the front end on a Riot? 38 to 40 inch adjustable. It comes set to 39 inches, and you just change spacers on the actual ski saddle to widen or narrow the sled by an inch either direction. It uses the trail spindle, but uses mountain arms. So it is a kind of a cross between a trail and a mountain front end. Uses your standard trail ski. So this is something that's very familiar and gets excellent bite on the trail. High speed cornering, low speed cornering, mellow cruising. It didn't seem to matter how I rode it, loose, hard pack, anything. It went around corners without lifting its inside ski, without getting kind of out of shape and segmenting the corner. It was great. Now there's a lot more going on there to why that works. The front end is obviously a huge part of it. Another massive part of it though is a low center of gravity and extremely centralized mass. And this is something we've talked a lot about with the Catalyst platform, is how centralized the mass is. But we haven't gone into a lot of detail or talked a lot about why having the engine so much lower makes such a big difference. And it's pretty obvious why that would be. The lower the engine is the single heaviest component on a snowmobile. The lower that engine is, the less likely the sled is to tip over in the corners. And I think that Arctic Cat has found a real sweet spot with this setup where the engine is mounted in terms of flat on-trail cornering. AJ and I and Mark, we all agree that the ergonomics on this sled are absolutely fantastic. In fact, when it comes to a ZR, AJ and I have agreed pretty strongly that the Catalyst has the best ergonomics in the business right now. Does that crossover to a crossover? And yes, it does. Sit down and stand up is the hallmark of a crossover sled. You're gonna sit down to ride on the trail, you're gonna stand up to ride off trail. So it has to have very flexible ergonomics. It has to work good when you're sitting down. It has to be comfortable and it has to be good for cornering. But when you stand up, it has to be good for getting off the side of the sled, for moving from side to side and balancing the sled from side to side. And the Catalyst does an incredible job of this. If there's one area of a crossover sled that I will not make any compromises on, it's the rear end. Arctic Cat has developed this skid frame, which they call the Cross Action. This is an excellent skid frame for on and off trail riding. We've ridden today in some of the deepest conditions I've ever ridden in on the flatlands. We're talking 3 and 4 feet of fresh snow. And this skid frame absolutely worked great. Wrapping around this skid frame is a cyclone track. It's a 1.75 lug, but you can get a 1.6 Cobra if you want. If you think about it, going off trail, especially if you find deep snow, that's something that requires horsepower. In my opinion, every great crossover sled on the market has been an 800 or an 850. Now, Arctic Cat has released the Catalyst this season with only a 600 under the hood. Everybody knows that. It's a cool 600. It's a laydown engine design, super low. It's got a belt drive. This is the airbox. It's all integrated. It's very, very unique setup, and it works excellent. But here's the facts of the matter. When you're out in 3.5 or 4 feet of powder, track speed is everything. This 600 works good, but it doesn't work great. Giving it credit as a 600, it is actually a very good 600 for this kind of riding, for deep snow riding. But there were multiple times as I was riding in deep snow where I could have just used a little bit more power. One thing I did find though in the deep snow is that these engine air intakes right here, this is the engine air intake, and it goes down into the air box up front here. Those intakes, even though they have frog skin coverings and there's an intake on both sides, they would get covered in snow and the sled would bog. So I think Arctic Cat needs to take a look at that, look at how snow is retained here on the side of the sled and come up with a better way, because that was problematic when we were in really deep snow. The very last moment you could possibly want a bog, you'd get one, and that caused some problems. So I think that's something that could definitely be improved. Again though, this only shows up in ridiculously deep snow conditions. In average snow conditions, that never becomes a problem. So I guess the question is, does the catalyst-based Riot 600 make a good crossover sled or a great crossover sled? You know, the truth of the matter is, it's a great crossover sled, it really is. If you're the kind of rider who doesn't need to go into 3.5 to 4 feet of powder all the time, then you're not going to care about the 600 motor. It works great. You're going to love the front end and how it handles, because it does handle excellent on the trail, and it may even be changing my mind about my rule that you have to have a trail width front end to be a true 50-50 crossover. You've got an excellent rear suspension that rides great on the trail, but really doesn't give up anything off trail either. Overall, this is a fantastic crossover snowmobile, and one that I would highly recommend to anybody who doesn't have to have an 850.